Hey, what's up? It's Mattie. I'm a professional producer, and today I'm continuing explaining every single plugin and what they do in Logic Pro. There are a lot of plugins in Logic, and because of that, I've divided this series into parts. This is the second part of that series. If you haven't seen the first part, you can watch it right up here. And if you want to see the next part, you can also watch it right up here. If it's not up there, that means it hasn't come out yet. You should subscribe so you don't miss out. Let's pick up where we left off in part one and get into it. Next up, we have dynamics, and we're starting with the adaptive limiter. The category of dynamics refers oftentimes to compression or expansion or just the actual volume of the track that you're working with itself or the amplitude of the sound waves. A limiter is a very heavy compressor. That basically means that anything above that ceiling is going to kind of get turned down and compressed underneath it. So this is really great for loudness, and this is a fantastic way and thing to use on your stereo output as you're trying to master your song. This will get it to the correct loudness standards and make sure that you can hear all of the parts of it. To adjust how much is going to go into the signal, you can choose the gain and up it here. Look ahead refers to how far in advance the DAW, in this case Logic, is going to look at the upcoming audio signal so that it can better prepare to actually smoosh it down below the out ceiling. See what happens when we put it on the output? We're already getting a big reduction here. Anytime this goes into the yellow, that means we're getting some of that gain reduction that we might actually want. Let's move on to the next part of dynamics, which is the trusty, the handy dandy compressor. Now for this part, I do happen to dive pretty deep into compression. If you already know compression or are familiar with it, you might want to skip ahead using the chapter markers below. If you are a beginner, I highly encourage you to watch it. Understanding compression is absolutely essential for producing modern music. And another shorthand way of getting compressor, because it is such a popular plugin, is just clicking on this little line right below here, and then you'll actually see the amount of compression that's happening with this purple bar. When you're working with the compressor, you'll notice a bunch of buttons up here. These are different types of compressors. You can think of different types of compressors like different flavors of ice cream. Each one adds a slightly different coloration and affects the sound slightly differently. Just like before, we have a lot of presets that you can use to go in and add to your specific sound. Even when you're using presets, it's important to dial in the threshold to your personal taste. The threshold is just going to mean how loud the signal has to be before it actually starts compressing. If we have a threshold of 0, we're probably never going to hit that on any of our tracks. Check it out. You can see I'm getting nothing from this. If I drag the threshold down, that's saying, okay, anytime we go -4 or we're going above that, which it looks like we are peaking above that, we're going to start to compress it. The farther down I go, the more the compression happens. This is saying -5 decibels are being compressed, -10 decibels are being compressed, -20 decibels are being compressed. For most reasons, I would just go by what feels right, but like anything between -5 and -10 is usually pretty good. Even a little bit lower can be really more subtle, but right in there is kind of the sweet spot that I'm aiming to shoot for if I'm just visualizing it. What's happening with this particular compressor is anytime it goes below that threshold, it's going to use whatever ratio we set to turn down the signal by that allotted amount. In other words, we can go in this graph mode and understand it a bit better. The ratio we can change by going here. This is saying, okay, we're going to have this signal that anytime it hits the threshold, which in this case is, we can adjust here, -20, it's going to flatten out the signal by a ratio of 27:1. For every 1 decibel we go up, it will turn down the signal by -27. So we get a really flat sounding curve here. If we take this here, it will be a little bit more natural sounding at like 4:1. 4:1 is a ratio that I recommend starting for vocals, but just for most instruments in general. It will give you enough feel for the compression to actually hear it, but it won't be overpowering, say like -30:1 or even 15:1. Let's go for 4:1 and just see what this sounds like on this graph. You can see that this knob is that volume of the actual signal itself, and every time it goes up there, it's getting compressed a certain amount. If we go back into the meter, we can see it's around -7, between -5 and 10. So we're at a pretty good point, but we just have to use our ears to determine, is it actually doing what we want it to do? Notice what it sounds like before and after. The compressed version will have a lot more punchy type drums. It'll sound a little bit more poppy in terms of the transients. And that's a fancy word for just saying the initial burst of audio information or sounds that are coming through. Let me turn this off and we'll explore. Before, after. The other important knobs to know for compression are the attack and release knobs. The attack is how fast after it goes over the threshold that it will start using this ratio. The release is how fast after the threshold, after it drops back below the threshold, that will actually hold on to the signal. Check it out what happens if I have a really, really slow release and a really fast attack. You can see that the line takes a while to get back down. We're telling it, okay, 5,000 milliseconds or 5 seconds it will take you to get back to baseline. The attack time affects the initial transients. If you have something super, super fast, you'll find that it's a really poppy sound. If you go something a little bit slower, you'll find that the initial attack of the original signal pops through a little bit better. Versus, for this case, I like a little bit like a medium fast attack, maybe like a medium attack around here, and then I'll do a little bit longer for the release. Now we can adjust the volume of this because we're losing some volume information by adding in some auto gain. And then my favorite thing to do is after I have a signal that I kind of am liking the sound of is dial back this mix knob a little bit so that I get some of that original performance still. So here's before, and here's after. You can hear I'm getting a little bit more poppiness, I'm getting a little bit more to cut through, and it's also a little bit louder. Okay, that was a long-winded explanation of compression, but it's one of the most important tools that you have in your arsenal as a producer. Let's move on to another dynamic powerhouse that we can actually take a look at right here, and that would be the de-esser. De-essers are specifically designed to de-ess the S sounds or sibilant sounds in vocal recordings. S's can really take away from the intelligibility of a performance, especially if they're too hot. De-essers work by using a dynamic compressor only on a specific band of frequency range. It's like using a compressor and an EQ kind of in one. If you band passed an EQ just like this and chose a frequency range and only compress that frequency range, that's what a de-esser is doing. We can use this filter solo to determine what sound our S's are actually on. Let's do that. She don't know what she don't know, she don't know what she don't know, she don't know, no, she don't know what she don't know. So around 6,300 looks pretty accurate to me. We'll take down the threshold here, and we have a threshold knob just like the compressor. We're saying anytime that this signal goes above this threshold at this particular junction, at this frequency, then we're going to reduce it by X amount of decibels. In this case, minus 20 will be our max. We'll turn off this filter solo and then hear what it sounds like in the mix. She don't know what she don't know, she don't know what she don't know, she don't. Be careful not to overdo this though, because if we really overdo it, we're going to sound like we have a lisp. She don't know what she don't know, she don't know what she don't know. You don't want to sound like you have a lisp. Next up, Enveloper. Enveloper is a really cool plugin, and it's actually one that I find myself using more frequently than you might imagine. The Enveloper is responsible for changing the transient of a signal, and that's what I use it for the most. An enveloper is just like it sounds. If you're familiar with synth design at all, an envelope is what the signal processes through before it actually comes and hits your ears. In other words, we have the attack, the release, and so on and so forth. If we up the attack, we're going to up the initial volume of the first spike of our sound. Listen to that poppy sound that it adds to it. We can change the attack time here. We can also change the release time here. If we up the release, we'll notice that we get more of that sustain that we might have not had before. We have to be careful with this too. Obviously, this is too much. This popping sound is being kind of a bit annoying, but this can be helpful if you're really trying to emphasize the transients of one sound. Another thing I often use this for is to use this and de-emphasize those transients. Check out what this sounds like. It's going to be way more smooth, and it probably will sit farther back in the mix because it doesn't have the initial transients going to round off that initial sound. It sounds a lot more smooth. And check it out in the mix. Versus normal. You get more of that pluck. So depending on if you want more pluck, if you want less pluck, you can use this to help out your sound. Let's move on to the next plugin in the dynamic chain, and that will be the expander. So we talked about compression, and the opposite of compression is expansion. This is what an expander does. When it hits a certain threshold, Logic will add sound to it. This can be great for sounds that are too dynamically similar and you want to emphasize different parts of it. I hardly use expanders. I find that most signals are too dynamically diverse. For example, even this guitar track. It is pretty dynamically diverse. I want to be able to hear each part better, so I'll use compressors. If you wanted to expand on this dynamic range, you would use an expander. If you're a beginner, I'd recommend staying away from this for now until you really understand compression. It's going to be way more helpful for you. Let's move on to the next one. Logic, dun, da, da, da. The multipress, oh no, the limiter. So just like the adaptive limiter before it, this is just another limiter type that you can add to your song. And I'll actually put this on my stereo out like before. This is kind of the beginnings of a mastering chain. Right? We have our release, we have our look ahead just like before, we have our output level, which is our output ceiling, then we have our gain knob, or how much we're going to add so that we can actually hit the correct volume level that we're shooting for. But I do have a full tutorial on mastering in Logic Pro using stock plugins you can check out right up here if you want more information on the limiters available to you. Let's move on to the next part of the dynamic chain, which would be the multipresser. Now, I really, really love the multipresser in Logic, and it's just a really great way of getting specific with your compression. It's like combining an EQ with a compressor. A multipresser works like this. This first band is saying 20 hertz to 150 hertz. So let's put this at 20 hertz to like 150. This first band is saying anytime we have a signal or a frequency in this, we're going to compress it a certain amount. And if you look here, we have our threshold, we have our ratio, just like before, our attack, and our release. Each of these are individual compressors that you can adjust the settings for different frequency ranges in your song. And I find them to be extremely, extremely helpful. One way that I might use a multi-band compressor is by compressing only kind of the high end of my vocal. Sometimes I record vocals and they're a bit too harsh between 2K and 4K. I don't necessarily want to take out those frequencies with EQ like I might here. Instead, I might solo these with a multi-band compressor. I might turn on my signal here, drop the threshold down, turn up my ratio, and now I'm only compressing that specific part of my sound. A great tool for just really fine-tuning your mix. Another thing I really like about this is you can solo each part of the frequency spectrum. So let me solo between 2K and 4K. What about the really high end, 5K and above? And what about the really low end? This is a really fantastic tool for determining what parts of the frequency spectrum you actually need to listen to and how to listen for them. Let's move on to the next dynamic plugin we have, which is the noise gate. A noise gate is extremely helpful, and it's most commonly used on heavy distorted guitars, but I use it for a lot of other things as well. It's saying anytime a signal falls below a certain threshold in volume, that we're going to just turn it off completely. You can even reduce this by an amount of your choosing. That's what the reduction knob is. But most of the time I'm reducing it down to almost nothing so that you can't hear it at all. That means you can get rid of any extra guitar noise that might be happening when you're not playing. Let's adjust the threshold so that it closes in between these. You can already hear that it's kind of giving it a little bit more rhythm. The notes are a bit more staccato as it closes between there. And that can be a really cool effect that you might want to be doing. You can mess around with the attack, the hold, and the release just like normal. The attack, it works the same as a compressor. Anytime it is below that threshold, how long will it hold before it actually goes back? And then release is when it does pass the threshold, how long will it take for it to release back up to normal? Instead of using a gate, you can also use a ducker, and ducker is pretty much the same thing as a gate, but instead of completely turning off the signal, you're just turning it down by a certain number of decibels. So in this case, you're kind of getting more of a flow with it instead of getting that sharp staccato type sound or that really short stagnated type sound. And that will do it for the dynamic section of these plugins. Dynamics are such a big part of production. If we've gone over one important section so far, it is dynamics. So rewatch this section if you weren't quite understanding it. I know I went into a lot of depth and detail about compression, but it really is that important to get right before you can start making some amazing sounding music. Next, we'll hop into another critical section for making music, the EQ. To it, we'll go into Logic, we'll go into EQ, and we'll go with the most popular option first, the channel EQ. Another way to get to the channel EQ is just to click on this EQ button here. It also gives you a little preview, a small preview of what to do, what you're doing right there. Pretty nifty. When we're using EQ, we are boosting and cutting and getting rid of different frequencies of the frequency spectrum. If we click on the analyzer right here, we can see what our signal looks like. In this case, we know that because we're dealing with the bass and because that the most loudest signal, the most loudest, is going to be in this low end, we see it the highest. Notice we don't have a lot of 2K and above, and that's because we're dealing with a bass line. We're just focusing on this lower end frequencies. That's generally where basses lie. While we're using EQ, we can shape it however we'd like to. This button right here will give us a low cut or a high pass. This will give us a high cut or a low pass. We can use this to shape our sound as need be. This orange one right here is called a shelf, and we can either boost or cut according to here using this visually. We have a high shelf over here on this purple one, and then the rest are just normal bell-shaped EQ curves that we can use to affect our sound. Another thing about the EQ that you need to know is this width of the bell-shaped curve or that you're dealing with is the Q factor. So you can see the frequency here, you can see the amount of decibels gained or reduced here, and then you can see the Q factor. A high Q factor will make this a very narrow bell. A low Q factor will make this a very wide bell. There are two main types of using EQ, either additive by adding or subtractive by subtracting. Both are totally valid, and for beginners, either one is fine. Just do what sounds good. However, as you get more advanced, I recommend sticking more towards subtractive EQ. EQs can color the sound if you add in frequency information. If you're adding this much, the EQ has to choose what to add itself. And that is where different EQs can have different types of sounds. If you decide to cut instead of boost, then the EQs will generally sound more of the same because you're just getting rid of the frequencies that already exist rather than boosting or adding frequencies that don't exist in the first place. Most of these EQs will be fairly similar, but the most common one I use is the channel EQ. It will absolutely do the job. Use the channel EQ, I promise, I promise. Let's go on to the next type of EQ that Logic has to offer, which is the linear phase EQ. The linear phase EQ takes a little bit more processing power than the channel EQ, but it also has the added benefit of keeping the phase of the instruments perfectly in sync and has no problems with that. For that reason, it's often preferred for mastering. I recommend using the channel EQ on your actual channel tracks because it's more flexible, and really that phase issue that I was talking about is super minimal, and it's going to take that less processing power. But the linear phase EQ uses some more advanced algorithms, a little bit more processing power, but it is a little bit more accurate. For that reason, I put it on your stereo out track on your mastering chain. Moving on to the next type of EQ, we have match EQ. Now this isn't one that I've played around with a lot, but what it will do is it will allow you to input a signal, use it on a specific track, and then have an EQ to match the EQ that you imported. I'm gonna learn this track to see what it is. Looks pretty good right there, learning it, nice. And let's use reference, will be this, and we'll match those. So for this current to match this reference, we are going to get this EQ curve. Obviously, because the reference is only focused in the low end and the current has a little bit more information here, to make that sound the same, sounds like a distorted fart, and that's not what I'm going for, but this just gives you an idea of how this can work. I don't ever use this. I wouldn't recommend it so much either. Let's go on to the next one. We'll go to EQ. Go to single band EQ here. Single band EQ is just exactly how it sounds. You have the Q factor, the slope, and the frequency. This doesn't have a visual aspect to it, which actually can be quite helpful, but it does have the different types that we were talking about: a high cut, a low cut, low shelf, a high shelf, or parametric, which is that bell-shaped EQ we were talking about before. High shelf, low cut, high cut. Same, but different. But let's move on. I don't use that single EQ ever. Move on to the next EQ, which is the vintage EQ collection. These vintage EQ collections are emulations of really popular EQ channel consoles that used to be in studios around the world. They still are, but it's much more common nowadays to find their digital equivalents, and Logic does a fairly decent job of recreating these. We'll start with the vintage console EQ. This is emulating a Neve 1073 preamp, which comes with some EQ knobs that you see here. Also comes with a drive output. Just like before, we can change the frequency of this low shelf. We have a parametric and we have a high shelf here, and then a low cut that we can use. We're working the same things that we're doing on this channel EQ. We're just doing it with knobs like you would in a studio back in 1985. I really love these vintage sounds, and I think that Logic has done a great job of using them. And I also love the fact that you're not tied to the actual visual aspect of these EQs. Focusing on just what sounds good in your mix is a great step in bettering your ears to actually find the frequencies that you want to change so that you can improve as a producer. Let's move on to the next type of EQ, which is the vintage graphic EQ. This is a classic EQ from API, and it's emulating that, but this is a little bit more straightforward. You can see we want to either boost these, cut these, blah, blah, blah. Here we go. Bob's your uncle. This one makes more sense. We also have a drive and output. And my favorite of the vintage EQ collection, I'll get into that, is the vintage tube EQ. And this last EQ is an emulation of a Pultec EQ called the EQ P1A. Famous EQ, sounds amazing. This Pultec emulated EQ is really, really great in my opinion for adding in some high sheen to a voice, and it's something I use on a lot of vocals actually. This high boost I just think sounds really, really good. Also got a great low boost sound as well. And just nice. And that will do it for part 2 of me, a professional producer, explaining every single plugin in Logic Pro. Check the description below for the links to the first part and the next part of this series. We're going to get through all of them, I promise. See you in the next one.